The night of September 26th should have been just another quiet evening in Yorktown Heights, New York. But for Ace Frehley, the legendary space ace of Kiss, it became a night that nearly ended everything. What the official reports called an accidental fire left behind more questions than answers. And as we dig deeper into what really happened that night, you'll discover why so many people believe there's a much darker story lurking beneath the surface. Before we go any further into this mystery, if you're fascinated by the untold stories of Ace Frehley and want to explore more secrets that never made it to the mainstream, hit that subscribe button right now. Trust me, what you're about to hear will make you question everything you thought you knew about that night. The fire started around 11:15 in the evening. Neighbors reported seeing flames shooting from the upper floor of Ace's home, a sprawling property that the guitarist had owned since his solo career took off in the 80s. By the time fire trucks arrived, the blaze had already consumed a significant portion of the second floor. Ace was found unconscious in his bedroom, suffering from severe smoke inhalation. The official investigation concluded that the fire was caused by candles left burning unattended. Case closed, right? Not even close. Let's start with what doesn't add up. Ace Frehley, despite his well-documented struggles with substances over the years, had always been meticulous about fire safety. Friends who visited his home regularly mentioned that he had an almost obsessive concern about candles, always extinguishing them before leaving a room. One former bandmate recalled visiting Ace's home just weeks before the fire and being struck by how carefully he monitored any open flames. This was a man who'd seen too many friends lose everything to preventable accidents. The idea that he'd simply leave multiple candles burning and fall asleep seems inconsistent with his known behavior patterns. But here's where things get interesting. 3 neighbors independently reported seeing an unfamiliar dark-colored sedan parked across the street from Ace's property earlier that evening. The vehicle sat there for approximately 40 minutes with its engine running before driving away around 10:30, less than an hour before the fire started. None of these neighbors had ever seen this car in the area before, and it never returned after that night. When investigators were told about this vehicle, it was noted in the report but never seriously pursued. Why would a suspicious car loitering near the scene of a near-fatal fire not warrant further investigation? Then there's the matter of the phone calls. In the 2 weeks leading up to the fire, Ace had mentioned to several close friends that he'd been receiving strange phone calls. According to his longtime guitar technician, these weren't typical fan calls or wrong numbers. The caller would stay silent on the line for several seconds before hanging up. On at least 2 occasions, Ace reported hearing what sounded like breathing before the line went dead. He'd changed his number twice in the preceding month, yet somehow these calls continued. The last one came at approximately 9:45 on the night of the fire, just 90 minutes before the blaze started. Now you might think I'm building a conspiracy theory out of coincidences, but let's talk about the insurance policy. Just 6 months before the fire, Ace had updated his homeowner's insurance, significantly increasing the coverage on the property. This fact was brought up during the investigation, though Ace's financial advisor explained that the increase was due to recent renovations and the addition of valuable equipment to his home studio. The timing seemed reasonable enough. But here's what wasn't in the official reports. The insurance company initially flagged the claim for additional review due to what they termed unusual policy modifications made just weeks before the incident. These modifications included specific clauses about coverage in cases of arson. Why would someone add detailed arson coverage unless they had reason to believe it might be necessary? Let's examine what was actually destroyed in the fire, The blaze consumed Ace's master bedroom, his personal office, and most devastatingly, a storage room where he kept decades of personal memorabilia and unreleased recordings. This wasn't just any collection of trinkets and old tapes. According to those close to him, this room contained original demo recordings from the early Kiss days, personal journals documenting the band's rise to fame, and letters exchanged between band members during some of their most turbulent periods. Some of this material had been mentioned in interviews as potentially forming the basis of a tell-all memoir that Ace had been considering writing. After the fire, nearly all of it was gone, reduced to ash and melted plastic. The timing of this potential memoir is crucial to understanding the full picture. In the months leading up to the fire, Ace had been in discussions with a major publishing house about a book deal. Unlike the autobiography he would eventually publish in 2011, this earlier project was described by his literary agent as much more revealing and potentially controversial. The agent mentioned that Ace had been working on chapters that dealt with financial disputes within Kiss, previously undisclosed conflicts between band members, and what he knew about certain business dealings that had never been made public. Several people in the publishing industry were aware of this project, and rumors had begun circulating in the music business community. Here's something that never made it into mainstream reporting about the fire. Ace had expressed concerns about this book project to his closest friends. One confidant recalled a conversation about 2 months before the fire where Ace seemed genuinely worried about potential repercussions of publishing certain stories. He specifically mentioned that some people wouldn't be happy if certain details came out. When pressed about who these people might be, Ace became evasive, saying only that there were powerful interests involved in the music industry who preferred certain stories remain buried. This friend thought Ace was being paranoid at the time. After the fire, they weren't so sure. The investigation itself raises eyebrows when you look at it closely. The lead investigator assigned to the case had a reputation for closing files quickly, often accepting the simplest explanation rather than pursuing more complex scenarios. Local firefighters who responded to the scene later expressed private frustration that certain aspects of the fire weren't examined more thoroughly. One firefighter, speaking anonymously years later, mentioned that the burn patterns in Ace's bedroom seemed inconsistent with candles as the ignition source. The fire appeared to have started in multiple locations simultaneously, which is highly unusual for an accidental candle fire. However, these observations were never formally included in the final report. Then there's the matter of accelerants. Standard fire investigation protocol includes testing for the presence of gasoline, lighter fluid, or other substances that might indicate arson. The initial tests at Ace's home came back negative, which supported the accidental fire conclusion. But here's the problem. Those tests were conducted almost 18 hours after the fire was extinguished. Any experienced arson investigator will tell you that accelerant testing becomes significantly less reliable after that much time has passed, especially if the scene has been contaminated by firefighting efforts. A more thorough investigation would have included testing within the first few hours and sampling from multiple locations throughout the affected areas. This didn't happen. What about Ace himself? His behavior in the immediate aftermath of the fire struck many as unusual. He was hospitalized for 3 days due to smoke inhalation and released with instructions to rest and avoid stress. Friends who visited him in the hospital reported that he seemed not just shaken, which would be entirely expected, but genuinely frightened. He asked several visitors whether anyone suspicious had been around the hospital or asking questions about him. He also requested that hospital staff not release any information about his condition or location to anyone who called. One nurse remembered him seeming paranoid, constantly looking toward the door, as if expecting someone to walk in. After his release from the hospital, Ace made a decision that surprised everyone who knew him. He immediately moved out of the property and never returned, even to salvage any remaining possessions. The house was eventually sold, but Ace never set foot in it again. For someone who had lived there for over 2 decades and had countless memories tied to that place, this complete abandonment seemed extreme. When asked about it in later interviews, he would only say that he needed a fresh start and didn't want to be reminded of that night. But people close to him suggested there was more to it. He seemed genuinely afraid to go back, as if returning might somehow invite danger. Now let's talk about what happened after the fire, because the aftermath might be even more revealing than the incident itself. The book project with the major publisher, dead. Ace never resumed work on it, and when his eventual autobiography came out the following year, it was noticeably less controversial than the earlier project had promised to be. Certain topics that he'd previously indicated would be covered in detail were mentioned only briefly or not at all. The financial disputes, the business dealings, the powerful interests he'd mentioned, all of it remained largely unexplored. Some industry insiders speculated that he'd been advised, or perhaps pressured, to tone down his revelations. There's another curious detail that emerged years later. A former employee who'd worked as a contractor on Ace's property in the months before the fire came forward with an interesting story. This person, who asked to remain anonymous, claimed they'd been asked to install a sophisticated security system at the house, including cameras covering all entry points and motion sensors throughout the property. Ace had apparently mentioned feeling unsafe and wanting better security. Here's the kicker. The security company's records show that the system was disabled at approximately 10:45 on the night of the fire, about 30 minutes before the blaze started. The system could be disabled from inside the house using a code that only Ace knew, or remotely if someone had access to the account credentials. The security company investigated the shutdown and determined it was done remotely, but they couldn't trace where the access came from. Let's consider the possibility that this was indeed just an accident. Maybe Ace did leave candles burning. Maybe he was more tired or distracted than usual that night. Maybe the strange phone calls were coincidental. Maybe the suspicious car was just someone lost or waiting for a friend. Maybe the timing of the insurance changes was purely practical. Maybe his reluctance to discuss certain topics in his book afterward was just him being more cautious with age. Maybe all of these things are exactly what they appear to be. Random pieces of an unfortunate but ultimately explainable incident. But when you line them all up together, the pattern becomes harder to dismiss. There's one more piece of this puzzle that's rarely discussed. In the weeks following the fire, several other people connected to Kiss or the music industry from that era reported unusual incidents. A former roadie had his storage unit broken into, with nothing stolen except boxes of old tour documents and photos. A journalist who'd been working on a documentary about 70s rock bands found that footage from interviews had been erased from his backup drives. A music executive who'd worked with Kiss in their early days received threatening messages warning him to stop talking about the past. Were these incidents connected to Ace's fire? There's no evidence linking them directly, but the timing raises questions. What makes this story even more compelling is the complete silence that descended after these incidents. The roadie never filed an official police report, claiming he just wanted to move on. The journalist abandoned his documentary project entirely, citing personal reasons. The music executive stopped giving interviews and retreated from public life. It's as if everyone who might have corroborated Ace's potential revelations suddenly decided that discretion was the better part of valor. This coordinated silence, whether coincidental or orchestrated, effectively ensured that whatever stories Ace might have told remained untold. Let's dig deeper into the physical evidence that was conveniently destroyed in that fire. Among the items lost were reportedly original contracts from the early Kiss days, documents that might have shed light on how profits were divided and who really controlled the business decisions. There were also photographs from recording sessions and tours, some of which allegedly showed interactions between band members and industry figures that had never been publicly acknowledged. One particularly intriguing loss was a collection of handwritten lyrics and notes that Ace had accumulated over decades, which he'd mentioned in interviews contained annotations and commentary about the real inspirations behind certain songs. All of this material, irreplaceable and potentially explosive, went up in flames that night. The financial angle deserves more scrutiny as well. After the fire, Ace's insurance payout was substantial, but those close to the situation noted that he seemed almost reluctant to accept it. He hired 3 different attorneys to review the settlement before finally agreeing to it, and even then, he reportedly told friends that he felt uncomfortable about the whole thing. This doesn't sound like someone who deliberately set a fire for insurance money. It sounds like someone who was deeply troubled by what had happened and wasn't sure who to trust. Then there's the curious case of the backup materials. In today's digital age, it would be natural to assume that Ace had copies of his important documents and recordings stored elsewhere. But remember, this was 2010, and Ace was from a generation that still trusted physical media more than digital storage. However, what's interesting is that he did have some digital backups stored on external hard drives that were kept in a fireproof safe in his home office. That safe survived the fire largely intact. But when it was opened, afterward, the hard drives inside had been wiped clean. The data recovery specialists who examined them said it appeared the drives had been deliberately erased, not damaged by heat or smoke. Someone had accessed that safe, wiped those drives, and left them there to be found. The only way to open that safe was with a combination that Ace kept extremely private. He hadn't even shared it with his closest family members. Now think about what that means. Either Ace himself erased those drives before the fire, which would suggest he knew something was coming and was trying to protect certain information or certain people, or someone else knew the combination and accessed the safe before or during the fire. Both scenarios are deeply troubling in their own ways. If Ace erased them himself, what was he afraid of? What information was so dangerous that even he felt it needed to be destroyed? If someone else did it, that means they had access to his home, his safe, and his most private documents. Either way, this wasn't the simple candle accident that the official report described. Let's talk about the candles themselves, since they're the cornerstone of the official explanation. Fire investigators found 3 melted candle bases in Ace's bedroom, which they cited as evidence of the fire's origin. But here's what's strange. Multiple people who'd been in that bedroom in the weeks before the fire, including a housekeeper who cleaned there twice a week, said they'd never seen candles in that room. Ace apparently didn't like scented candles, and he certainly didn't burn them in his bedroom where all his guitars were stored. The bedroom was treated almost like a shrine to his instruments, with controlled humidity and temperature. The idea that he'd introduce open flames into that environment seems fundamentally out of character. So where did those candles come from? Were they placed there after the fire started to create a plausible explanation? Were they there but unlit, only to be ignited by flames from another source? Or had Ace, for some unknown reason, changed his habits that particular night? The investigation never answered these questions because it never seriously asked them. Once the candle theory was established, it became the official narrative, and any evidence that contradicted it was either ignored or explained away. There's also the matter of Ace's activities in the hours before the fire. He'd been working in his home studio earlier that evening, according to neighbors who saw lights on in that part of the house. He'd made several phone calls, including one to his attorney that lasted nearly 40 minutes. What was discussed in that call has never been disclosed, protected by attorney-client privilege. But the timing is significant. Less than 3 hours after ending that call, his house was on fire. Was he seeking legal advice about something? Was he documenting information that someone didn't want documented? The attorney has never commented, publicly, maintaining professional confidentiality. But sources close to that law office suggested the call had been about sensitive business matters related to Ace's past. The neighborhood itself adds another layer to this mystery. Yorktown Heights is a quiet, affluent area where everyone knows everyone else's business. It's not the kind of place where suspicious activity goes unnoticed. Yet on the night of the fire, multiple unusual things happened, and nobody thought to connect them until much later. Besides the dark sedan that sat outside Ace's house, there were reports of a utility van parked 2 blocks away with its hazard lights on, as if the driver was checking something or waiting for someone. A dog walker reported seeing someone in dark clothing walking quickly away from the direction of Ace's property around 11 o'clock. Individually, these incidents might mean nothing. Collectively, they paint a picture of coordinated activity in a neighborhood where such coordination would be highly unusual. What about the fire department's response? They arrived quickly, within 7 minutes of the first 911 call. But by the time they got there, the fire had already spread with unusual rapidity. Professional firefighters commented that the speed of the fire's progression was inconsistent with a simple candle fire. Candle fires typically start slow, smoldering before building into flames. This fire seemed to have exploded into intensity very quickly, more consistent with multiple ignition points or the presence of accelerants. Yet as we've discussed, accelerant testing came back negative, though it was conducted far too late to be truly conclusive. Here's something that chills the blood. 3 months after Ace's fire, a former music producer who'd worked with several major rock bands in the 70s had a similar incident at his home in California. His house fire was also attributed to candles, and he also lost irreplaceable archives and documents from his decades in the industry. He'd also been planning to write a memoir. The similarities are striking enough to raise questions, but there's no official investigation connecting the two events. Just another coincidence in a story full of them. The human cost of that night extends beyond the physical injuries Ace suffered. Friends say he was never quite the same afterward. The paranoia he'd shown in the hospital never fully went away. He became more isolated, more careful about who he trusted, more guarded in his public statements. The creative spark that had driven him to consider writing that controversial memoir seemed to dim. He still made music, still performed, but something had changed. Whether that change came from the trauma of nearly dying or from the realization that some truths are too dangerous to tell, the effect was the same. A voice that might have revealed important truths about the music industry fell silent on those particular topics. The official narrative remains unchanged. It was an accident. Candles were left burning. Ace was lucky to survive. End of story. But dig beneath that surface. Talk to the people who were there, who knew Ace during that period, who understand the complex and sometimes dangerous politics of the music industry, and a different picture emerges. It's a picture of a man who knew too much, who was preparing to tell stories that others didn't want told, and who suddenly found himself in a life-threatening situation that conveniently destroyed the evidence he'd been compiling. Was someone trying to silence Ace Frehley? Was the fire a warning that worked exactly as intended? Did he decide that whatever truths he'd been planning to reveal weren't worth his life? Or are we connecting dots that don't actually form a picture, seeing sinister intent where there's only coincidence and misfortune? The truth is, we may never know for certain. What we do know is that after that night, Ace became more careful about what he said publicly, more guarded about his past, and more reluctant to dig into the controversial corners of rock history. The Space Ace survived that night in September 2010, but something changed. Whether that change came from natural caution after a near-death experience or from something more calculated and threatening, the effect was the same. Some stories stayed buried, some questions remained unanswered, and a house fire that should have been a straightforward investigation became another mysterious chapter in the complicated life of a rock and roll legend. The ashes have long since been cleared away. The house has new owners who probably have no idea about that night. The official reports sit in file cabinets somewhere, gathering dust. But the questions remain, hovering like smoke that never quite clears. And every now and then, when Ace Frehley gives an interview and someone asks about that night, you can see something flicker in his eyes. Fear, anger, relief that he survived, or maybe just the weight of knowing more than he's willing to say.